The morning rush hour traffic crawled along the congested city streets, horns blaring and tempers flaring. But one driver, Karen Ramsey, was having none of it. As her sleek Mercedes SUV inched forward, she gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, eyes narrowed in unadulterated fury. "Move it, you idiots," she spat, slamming her palm against the horn. "I don't have time for this." Karen's heart raced, her entitled attitude reaching a boiling point. How dare these incompetent drivers slow her down? She had an important business meeting to attend, and she wouldn't let a little traffic stand in her way. As the car in front of her hesitated at a yellow light, Karen seized the opportunity. She floored the accelerator, careening through the intersection just as the light turned red. Horns blared, tires screeched, but Karen paid no heed. Her only focus was getting to her destination on time. Unfortunately, her reckless maneuver had caught the attention of an unmarked police car trailing several cars behind. Before Karen could blink, the siren wailed, and red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. What the? Karen's mouth fell open in shock. No, no, no. This can't be happening. Cursing under her breath, she reluctantly pulled over to the curb, her mind racing with excuses. As the plainclothes officer approached her window, Karen steeled herself, prepared to unleash her most charming and persuasive smile. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said, his voice calm and measured. "Do you have any idea why I pulled you over?" Karen flashed him her most winning smile. "Officer, I'm so terribly sorry. I was just trying to get to an important meeting, and the traffic was just—" "You ran a red light back there," the officer interrupted, his expression unreadable. "That's a serious violation." Karen's smile faltered, her brow furrowing in confusion. But I was in a hurry. Surely you can understand." "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your license and registration," the officer said, his tone now laced with a hint of impatience. Karen's mind raced, panic setting in. She had never been in trouble with the law before, and the thought of facing any kind of consequences for her actions was unthinkable. Surely she could talk her way out of this. "Officer, please," she pleaded, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "I'm already running late, and this is all just a simple misunderstanding. I'm sure we can work something out, perhaps without any unpleasantness." The officer's eyes narrowed, and he stepped back, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the vehicle." Karen's heart sank as the full weight of the situation dawned on her. This was no ordinary traffic stop, and this was certainly no ordinary officer. As she reluctantly complied, her mind raced with the realization that her entitled behavior had finally caught up with her. As Karen stepped out of her Mercedes, her mind was still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. This was not how her morning was supposed to go. She was supposed to breeze through traffic, deliver her big presentation, and then bask in the accolades of her colleagues. But now, here she was, pulled over by what appeared to be just another ordinary cop. "Officer, I really must insist that we resolve this matter quickly," Karen said, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. "I have a very important meeting to attend, and I simply cannot afford to be delayed any further." The plainclothes officer eyed her coolly, seemingly unaffected by her displays of entitlement. "Ma'am, I'm afraid I can't just let you off with a warning. You clearly broke the law back there, and that puts other drivers at risk." Karen's eyes narrowed, her frustration building. "But you don't understand. This is a matter of utmost importance. My career could be on the line here." She took a step closer to the officer, her chin tilted upwards in defiance. The officer held up a hand, halting her advance. "I'm going to have to ask you to calm down, ma'am. Escalating the situation isn't going to help your case." Karen scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Calm down? How dare you tell me to calm down? Do you have any idea who I am?" She reached into her purse, fumbling for her business card. I'll have you know that I'm an executive at one of the biggest firms in this city. I don't have time for your petty traffic stops." The officer's expression hardened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, I don't care who you are or what your job is. The law applies to everyone equally, regardless of their status or position." He reached for his handcuffs, the metallic click sending a chill down Karen's spine. "What are you doing?" Karen's eyes widened in alarm, her entitled bravado giving way to genuine fear. "You can't be serious. I demand that you let me go this instant." "Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for reckless driving and failure to obey a traffic signal," the officer said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the cold steel of the handcuffs closed around her wrists, Karen's world seemed to crumble around her. The realization that her entitled behavior had finally caught up with her sent a wave of panic through her body. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat, replaced by a sinking feeling of dread. This was not how her day was supposed to go. But as the officer guided her towards the unmarked police car, Karen knew that her reckless actions had finally caught up with her, and this time, there would be no easy way out. As the unmarked police car pulled away from the curb, Karen sat in the back seat, her hands cuffed tightly behind her back. The reality of her predicament had finally sunk in, and she could feel a familiar sense of panic rising in her chest. This was not how her day was supposed to go. Karen was used to having things her way, to effortlessly charming her way out of any inconvenient situation. But this time, her entitled behavior had caught up with her in the most humiliating way possible. She stole a glance at the plainclothes officer, her eyes narrowed in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You can't do this to me," she hissed, her voice trembling with outrage. "I demand that you release me immediately." The officer, however, remained unfazed, his gaze fixed firmly on the road ahead. "Ma'am, I've already explained that the law applies to everyone, regardless of their status or position," he said, his tone steady and unwavering. Karen scoffed, her grip on her composure slipping further. "Do you have any idea who I am? I'm a top executive at one of the most prestigious firms in this city. Surely, you can make an exception just this once." The officer shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't make exceptions. You broke the law, and there are consequences for that. Now, I'd suggest you remain calm and cooperate with us." Karen's jaw clenched, her frustration boiling over. "Cooperate? You want me to cooperate? This is an outrage. I have a reputation to uphold, and you're ruining it." As the car pulled into the police station, Karen's heart sank. She had never been in a situation like this before, and the thought of being processed and booked like a common criminal was almost too much to bear. Once inside, the officers led her to a small holding cell, where they removed the handcuffs and instructed her to remain seated. Karen paced the tiny enclosure, her mind racing with 1,000 desperate thoughts. "This can't be happening," she muttered under her breath, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. "I don't belong here. I need to get out of this place." But as the reality of her situation began to sink in, Karen's bravado slowly crumbled. She sank onto the hard bench, her head in her hands, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. The consequences of her entitled behavior had finally caught up with her, and in that moment, Karen realized that the world did not revolve around her as she had always believed. She was no longer the untouchable queen of her domain, but a simple human being, subject to the same laws and rules as everyone else. As she sat in the cold, stark holding cell, Karen couldn't help but wonder how she had gotten herself into this mess, and how she was going to get out of it. Time seemed to crawl by as Karen sat in the holding cell, her mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. She had never felt so helpless, so out of control, and the realization only fueled her growing sense of panic. "This can't be happening," she muttered to herself, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the hard wooden bench. "I have to get out of here. There has to be a way." But as the minutes ticked by, Karen's desperation only continued to mount. She paced the small enclosure, her designer heels clicking against the hard floor, as she racked her brain for a way to escape her predicament. Finally, the sound of a door opening drew her attention, and she turned to see a uniformed police officer standing in the doorway. "Ms. Ramsey, the detective is ready to see you now," the officer said, his tone neutral. Karen straightened her shoulders, determined to regain some semblance of control. "It's about time," she snapped, striding past the officer with as much dignity as she could muster. The detective's office was a stark, no-nonsense space, with bare walls and a cluttered desk that seemed to reflect the no-frills attitude of its occupant. As Karen entered, a gruff-looking man in his 50s looked up, his brow furrowed in a frown. "Ms. Ramsey, I'm Detective Grimes," he said, his voice gruff. "Have a seat." Karen hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting around the room, before finally perching on the edge of the hard chair across from the detective's desk. She cleared her throat, her gaze meeting his with a hint of defiance. "Well, Detective, I hope we can resolve this little misunderstanding quickly," she said, her tone dripping with false charm. "I have a very important meeting to get to, and I'm sure we can work something out." Detective Grimes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Ramsey, I'm afraid this is no misunderstanding. You were caught on camera running a red light and driving recklessly. That's a serious offense." Karen's heart sank as the realization dawned on her. This was no ordinary traffic stop. The officer who had pulled her over had been a plainclothes detective, and she had fallen right into his trap. Her usual tactics of charm and entitlement were clearly not going to work this time. But surely there must be something we can do," she stammered, her composure slipping. "I can't afford to have a criminal record. My career, my reputation. Everything is at stake." Detective Grimes regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Ramsey, the law applies to everyone, regardless of their status or position. You're going to have to face the consequences of your actions, just like anyone else." As the detective's words sank in, Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her. She had always been able to manipulate her way out of trouble, to use her wealth and influence to avoid any real consequences. But now, faced with the harsh reality of the justice system, she realized that her entitled behavior had finally caught up with her. With a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach, Karen knew that this time there would be no easy way out. As the detective's words hung in the air, Karen felt a familiar sense of panic rising within her. Her carefully cultivated facade of power and privilege was crumbling, and she struggled to maintain her composure in the face of this unexpected challenge. "You can't be serious," she sputtered, her eyes narrowing in a desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "There must be something we can do, some way to make this all go away. Surely, you understand the importance of my position and the damage this will do to my reputation." Detective Grimes regarded her with a cold, steady gaze, unfazed by her attempts at intimidation. "Ms. Ramsey, I'm afraid the law is quite clear on this matter. You broke the law, and you'll have to face the consequences." Karen could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the familiar rush of adrenaline that had always served her so well now failing to provide the same sense of empowerment. She leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails gripping the edge of the desk as she tried to appeal to the detective's sense of reason. "But you don't understand," she pleaded, her voice tinged with desperation. "This isn't just about me. My company, my clients, they all depend on me. If word of this gets out, it could be devastating. Surely, we can find some way to make this all go away, quietly and discreetly." The detective's expression hardened, and he shook his head. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ramsey, but I don't make deals, and I don't sweep things under the rug. You broke the law, and you'll have to face the consequences." Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her as the realization dawned that her usual tactics of manipulation and entitlement were failing her. She had always been able to charm her way out of trouble, to use her wealth and influence to avoid any real consequences. But now, faced with the harsh reality of the justice system, she found herself grasping at straws. "Please, you have to understand," she implored, her voice trembling with desperation. "My career, my reputation. Everything I've worked for is at stake here. Surely there must be some way we can resolve this without a formal arrest or criminal charges." Detective Grimes shook his head, his expression unwavering. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Ms. Ramsey. The evidence is clear, and the law is clear. You'll be facing a reckless driving charge, and we'll be forwarding the information to the district attorney's office." As the detective's words sank in, Karen felt a sense of defeat wash over her. For the first time in her life, her carefully constructed persona of power and entitlement had failed her, and she was faced with the harsh reality of being held accountable for her actions. In that moment, the realization dawned that the world did not, in fact, revolve around her, and that her past behavior had finally caught up with her in the most unexpected and humiliating way. As the gravity of the situation settled in, Karen felt a sense of dread and disbelief wash over her. For the first time in her life, her well-honed tactics of manipulation and entitlement had failed her, leaving her feeling exposed and powerless. The detective's steadfast refusal to bend the rules or make any concessions only served to deepen her frustration. Karen was accustomed to getting her way, to using her wealth, status, and charm to navigate any obstacle that stood in her path. But now, faced with the harsh realities of the justice system, she found herself grasping at straws, her usual tactics crumbling before her eyes. "This can't be happening," she murmured, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the edge of the desk as she desperately searched for a way out. "I don't belong here. I'm not like these common criminals." Detective Grimes regarded her with a steadfast gaze, unfazed by her displays of entitlement. "Ms. Ramsey, the law applies to everyone, regardless of their status or position. You broke the law, and you'll have to face the consequences." Karen's eyes narrowed, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "But you don't understand," she insisted, her voice edged with a hint of desperation. "My career, my reputation. Everything I've worked for is on the line here. Surely there must be some way we can come to an understanding." The detective shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ramsey, but I don't make deals, and I don't sweep things under the rug. You'll have to take this up with the district attorney's office." As the detective's words sank in, Karen felt a wave of panic wash over her. She had never imagined herself in a situation like this, where her wealth and influence would fail to shield her from the consequences of her actions. For so long, she had lived in a world where the rules simply didn't apply to her, where her status and privilege allowed her to bypass the very systems that governed the lives of ordinary people. But now, faced with the harsh realities of the justice system, Karen found herself stripped of her carefully cultivated facade of power and control. The carefully constructed persona she had built over the years, the polished executive, the respected community leader, was crumbling before her eyes, revealing the true nature of her entitled and reckless behavior. As the weight of her situation began to sink in, Karen felt a newfound sense of vulnerability and fear. She had always taken her privilege for granted, assuming that it would shield her from any real consequences. But now, as she sat across from the unyielding detective, she realized that she was no longer the untouchable queen of her domain. She was just another individual, subject to the same laws and rules as everyone else. The realization was both humbling and terrifying, and as Karen's eyes brimmed with tears of frustration and despair, she knew that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. As the gravity of her situation began to fully sink in, Karen found herself grappling with a range of conflicting emotions. Anger, fear, and a deep sense of vulnerability all warred within her, threatening to unravel the carefully curated image she had worked so hard to cultivate over the years. Gone were the days of effortlessly charming her way out of trouble or using her wealth and influence to sidestep the consequences of her actions. Now, faced with the uncompromising gaze of the detective, Karen's usual tactics of entitlement and manipulation were failing her, leaving her feeling exposed and powerless. "This can't be happening," she murmured, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she ran them through her meticulously styled hair. "I don't belong here. I'm not a criminal." But the detective remained unmoved, his expression unwavering as he regarded her with a steady, unblinking stare. "Ms. Ramsey, the law applies to everyone, regardless of their status or position," he reiterated, his voice tinged with a hint of impatience. "You broke the law, and you'll have to face the consequences." The words cut through the haze of Karen's panic, and she felt a fresh wave of indignation wash over her. "But you don't understand," she pleaded, her voice rising in desperation. "My career, my reputation. Everything I've worked for is on the line here. Surely, there must be some way we can make this all go away, quietly and discreetly." The detective shook his head, his expression resolute. "I'm sorry, but that's not an option. The evidence is clear, and the district attorney's office will be handling this case. You'll have to face the charges and let the legal process run its course." As the detective's words sank in, Karen felt a sense of dread and resignation settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was facing the harsh reality of being held accountable for her actions, and the prospect of having to navigate the complex and often unforgiving legal system filled her with a deep and unsettling sense of vulnerability. Gone were the days of effortlessly manipulating her way out of trouble, of using her wealth and status to circumvent the rules that governed the lives of ordinary people. Now, stripped of her usual tactics of entitlement and privilege, Karen found herself confronted with the stark realization that she was no longer the untouchable queen of her domain, but rather a mere mortal, subject to the same laws and consequences as everyone else. As the weight of this realization settled upon her, Karen felt a sense of dread and resignation wash over her. She knew that the road ahead would not be an easy one, and that the consequences of her actions would likely reverberate through every aspect of her life. But even as she grappled with this new and unsettling reality, a part of her couldn't help but wonder. Was this the moment that would finally force her to confront the flaws and limitations of her own entitled behavior? As the reality of her situation fully sank in, Karen found herself grappling with a whirlwind of emotions. Gone was the confident, entitled woman who had always relied on her wealth, status, and charm to navigate the obstacles of life. In her place stood a vulnerable, fearful individual, stripped of the very privileges that had once shielded her from the consequences of her actions. Sitting across from the unyielding detective, Karen felt a newfound sense of humility and self-awareness washing over her. For so long, she had operated under the assumption that the rules simply didn't apply to her, that her position and influence would always be enough to shield her from any real repercussions. But now, faced with the harsh realities of the justice system, she found herself forced to confront the stark and unsettling truth. She was no longer the untouchable queen of her domain, but rather just another individual, subject to the same laws and regulations as everyone else. The weight of this realization was both humbling and terrifying, and as Karen's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, she found herself grappling with a profound sense of vulnerability and uncertainty. Gone were the days of effortlessly manipulating her way out of trouble, of using her wealth and status to circumvent the very systems that governed the lives of ordinary people. As the detective continued to outline the charges she would be facing, Karen felt a growing sense of dread settle in the pit of her stomach. The thought of having to navigate the complex and often unforgiving legal system, of potentially facing criminal charges and the accompanying social stigma, was enough to send a chill down her spine. Yet, even as she wrestled with these overwhelming emotions, a small part of Karen couldn't help but wonder if this was the moment she had needed all along. A chance to confront the flaws and limitations of her own entitled behavior, to truly understand the impact her actions had on those around her. For so long, she had operated in a bubble, insulated from the harsh realities of the world by her wealth and privilege. But now, as she sat in that stark, impersonal interrogation room, Karen realized that her actions had consequences that extended far beyond her own personal interests. She had wielded her power and influence with reckless abandon, never once considering the ripple effects of her behavior on those less fortunate than herself. And in that moment, a glimmer of self-awareness began to take root within her. Perhaps, Karen thought, this was the wake-up call she needed, a chance to reckon with the ways in which her entitled mindset had shaped her decisions and actions, and to ultimately strive for a more empathetic and responsible approach to life. As the detective's voice faded into the background, Karen found herself lost in the swirling maelstrom of her own thoughts. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt a newfound sense of resolve, a determination to confront her own flaws, to make amends for her past transgressions, and to emerge from this ordeal a better, more compassionate person. It was a reckoning she had long avoided, but now, as she faced the consequences of her entitled behavior, Karen knew that this was the moment that would define the rest of her life.